I'd like to introduce Steve Stick, who is a friend as well as a colleague. He's the Director of the Walyan Respiratory Research Centre at TKI and an NHMRC Leadership Fellow. I think Steve's a good person to have give this first talk. I was on a CRE panel for NHMRC a couple of years ago with Steve, and I must admit I was very impressed by the way that he understood things and put forcibly his views. So hopefully we'll get the same sort of punchy presentation today. So welcome, Steve.
Can I ask you, how many of you feel comfortable interrupting me on the way through? Good, okay. Do feel free to stop me and ask a question if something's not clear. Okay, so I think the first thing I want to say is that, you know, I can only give my perspective. I've had a really rewarding career as a clinician, researcher, and I would encourage anyone who wants to do research as part of their clinical work to really push to do that. It's something worth pursuing. But not everyone has the same pathway, so this is just an example. I started my research as a student, first of all in Brazil, in the middle of Bahia, under the guidance of a guy called Philip Marsden, who was an Englishman who had a post at Brasilia University and also an affiliation with Cornell University in the States. And he was interested in a range of tropical diseases, but mainly mucocutaneous leishmaniasis. As a student, I was in awe of how they managed their research program in very difficult circumstances. But I was also caught out when he was inebriated in a bar and needed a loan to pay the bill when he left on our journey to the research site. The other person who encouraged me was a guy called Prof. Banat Vala at St Thomas's Hospital, who was one of the pioneers in rotavirus, and he got me involved in a project in Papua New Guinea, which I'll say a little bit more about. So these were the conditions we did the research in. The top slide in the middle there, you can pick the research building quite easily because it's the one with the Land Cruiser outside. Nobody else had transport, but we needed transport to get out to the various sites. When I was in Papua New Guinea, we didn't have the luxury of a Land Cruiser, and in fact, everything was done on, I'll just get rid of this. Everything was done on foot, which might explain the logistics of the study, which ran into a few problems. Frank Shan, who's an Australian intensivist in Melbourne, had set up the governance framework for research in Papua New Guinea, the training program. He did incredible research up in Papua New Guinea and wrote a textbook for doctors. And the reason why there's a can of spam on the slide is that in order to get samples from kids who might have rotavirus, recruitment wasn't going very well in the Southern Highlands where we were based. 3 medical students just trying to do what the prof told us to do. We weren't getting many kids with diarrhea that we could get samples from. So we started to bribe the families with cans of spam to get the samples. Sampling numbers went up, but I've no idea whether it was from hundreds of the same kid or, you know, different kids. And in the end, it didn't really matter because we were based in this very remote area, and to get the samples back to the UK, they had to be flown out to Port Moresby and then on to the UK, little polystyrene box with hundreds of samples of faeces. And unfortunately, they were left on this airstrip and we never saw them again. The reason I mentioned Frank Shan is when I got back to the UK, he wrote to me saying, did I have ethics approval for the study? And I had no idea. We complain about governance, practices these days, but I went in there trusting my mentor and supervisor that everything was sorted out, but I had no idea whether we had ethics approval. Certainly what we were doing with the spam was unethical by today's standards, I suspect that we did not have ethics approval for the study. In 1984, everything changed, and really, the days of the personal computer meant that data analysis could be done easily at home. It made writing easier, presentations more professional. Everything got faster. And that's the legacy we have now. Speed is of the essence. It also meant that competition increased. People could do things more effectively. More people could do things more effectively. And the contrast with that study in Papua New Guinea with a study that's just been completed, we did a clinical trial in Chile using interferon to try and halt the transmission of COVID. And the difference is quite simple. And I'm not going to go through this slide, but from the original ideation through setting up collaborations and then the analytical processes required for the proteomics, genomics and everything was all set out in advance. The analytical pipelines were set up with the bioinformaticians and everything. There was data integration throughout, which meant that we could tell at any point of the study exactly when a sample was taken. It was time-stamped, and it was done in real time. We knew who'd taken the sample, who transported it to the lab, and we could see in real time as the biobank increased. That's the sort of QC and governance we now have over clinical research. So my pathway started as an undergraduate. I went to Cambridge University where they taught medicine as a basic science. And that's where my interest. I had supervisions in a physiology lab with my supervisor, 2 other people, and an anaesthetised calf. We could see the oscilloscopes. We could, his research assistants and postdocs would come in and ask him questions while he was doing an experiment. And that's where my fascination with research started. I undertook my paediatric training in the UK and then came to Australia, and I had 3 significant mentors. Professor Lou Lando, who was grandfather really of respiratory medicine in kids, Peter Sly, who's now in Queensland, and Peter LeSuef up on the right there, who's asleep during one of my talks. I went on, I was enthused to do a PhD, which was probably the best time in my research life, I think, and then became a consultant, head of department, and then another key thing that happened to me was back in 2000, I got an NHMRC practitioner fellowship. It was the year the scheme was announced. We had no idea who was going to get them. The research fellows at the time looked down on these practitioner fellowships somewhat. It wasn't real research. These were clinicians, doing a little bit of dabbling. But in fact, they grew in stature. They became incredibly competitive over the years. And now they've been absorbed into the NHMRC fellowship program as investigator fellowships. So that was the key for me because it gave me quarantined research time. Doesn't want to move forward. There you go. And it opened up a world to me. I've got collaborations all around the world. I've been able to visit most of the places. So it's been a good life, it's been coupled with a good family life. I've also managed to have time with family. So you don't have to do one or the other, you know, it's not, you don't have to work to the point where you can ignore other things. Life as a clinician researcher is exciting, it's stimulating, and the point is that when some things are not going so well, if you've got these multiple views on the world, then there's always something going right. How's science funding? Well, science funding is not so good. The point to realise here is that the gross expenditure on research and development has been going down for over 10 years. The good thing is that expenditure on health R&D has been going up. And given that the government component of that is gone down a little bit, it means that the government must be favouring health over other areas to some degree. And that's certainly the case. You can see here that the funding for health has gone up relative to other areas, but overall the health funding for R&D is going down. If you look at basic versus clinical science, there's and I won't go through this slide, but I'll just make the point that there is a new focus on clinical research, much to the chagrin of basic scientists. And I think this is a mistake, but nonetheless, it's a reality and something that we can take advantage of. And if you look at males versus females, more women are getting grants than men, but they're getting less money. So whether they're more realistic about their research aspirations or working in areas that require less funding, who knows? But there is genuinely a move towards equality in research. And there is investment in clinical research, 200 million over 10 years, that's 20 million a year. That's going to buy about 100 clinician researchers nationwide. The problem is that there's a disproportionate expenditure of money in the eastern states, in particular Victoria. So you have to work harder for your money in WA, there's no question. But we have some great clinicians and scientists and people who can mentor and help smooth the pathway. This is worth having a look at, I think. It's a survey done of clinician researchers. My take-home message here is that medical researchers and allied health researchers make up the bulk of clinician researchers. And of that group, medical researchers tend to have a higher degree, either an MD or a PhD. I don't pretend that you have to have a higher degree in order to do clinical research, but a PhD isn't an exit exam. It's a qualification in research methods. And it's the starting point of a research journey. Clearly, the nature of science has changed. Back in the days of H.G. Wells, the threat was coming from Mars. The threat now is from artificial intelligence. And you've seen recently that, you know, everyone's talking about extinction of humans because of AI. I don't think we should worry too much, and even if that was the case, if it delivers us a more rational population for the Earth, it may not be a bad thing. We've gone from hypothesis-driven research. It started with David Hume saying no amount of accumulation of information is enough to conclude that a certain situation represents reality. Doesn't matter how many white swans you see, you only need to see one black one to refute the idea that all swans are white. Karl Popper took that a stage further to say that as far as scientific statement speaks about reality, it must be falsifiable. And insofar as it's not falsifiable, it does not speak about reality. And all he was saying is that some statements can't be falsified. The pot at the end of the rainbow cannot be falsified, therefore it's not a scientific statement. Whereas Santa exists, can be falsified. You can go to the North Pole and see if he lives there, and you can falsify the statement that Santa lives at the North Pole. Except, of course, that the North Pole's moving a little bit, and maybe they're just not looking in the right place. We've moved to really data-driven science. You know, we've got big data. It's been popularised since the early 1990s with the advent of increasing in computer power. You know, we now have computers up in West Perth that have 130 petabytes of capacity. And open data, the ability to share data quickly and have pipelines of analysis, means that we can have serendipitous discovery. And we increase the likelihood of serendipitous discovery happening. And it's created a whole environment of systems biology which is coming up with new drugs, new biomarkers, and new understanding of disease. And these are not necessarily hypothesis-driven. And you'll often see when we first started to talk about this to reviewers, saying that we're going on a fishing expedition. And that may be true, but we're going with specific bait to find something new and understanding of biology. So barriers facing clinician researchers, Tim alluded to these: limited funding opportunity, time constraints, access to resources, all of them there. This slide was created by a chatbot. And I think we will be using this sort of AI and machine learning increasingly. And I'm not too worried about it, to be honest. So finally, I'm just going to reflect on some things that can help. We all have 24 hours in a day, and if you don't have time, then it's not that you don't have time, it's just that something is not a priority. What do you have to do to win a Nobel Prize? Well, these are some comments from some winners. Spend time with family and friends. Sleep well was one. Prioritise. And Elizabeth Blackburn's comments, I think, are salient. Family, work and sleep don't each have to be a constant focus, i.e. they don't have to be the focus equally all of the time. And it's also okay to be tired. Tired doesn't necessarily mean sleep deprived. If you run a marathon, you're tired at the end of it. It doesn't mean you're sleep deprived. You know, so being tired is just a reflection of activity and effort. How do you find your niche? Well, there's this constant tension between what you love and what you need to do to earn money, okay? And what are you good at versus where are the gaps? And you can navigate these a little bit, you know, and find a sweet spot. But just remember that, you know, the sweet spot can move around a little bit on any particular day, week or year. You're not always sitting in the zone, you know? Sometimes things are not going to go well. And there's a few ways of identifying the gaps, because ultimately that's what you want to do. You don't want to be doing research in an area that's well understood. And you can do that, and I've given a few clues just there. I think the important thing is you've got to make time, because the real barrier for clinician researchers is quarantine research time. So check out all the sources of funding. Remember that 20% of your health department funding is meant to be for research. And advocate for that, and make sure within your departments and whatever that you make the point that you're using 20% of your time for research. Try and avoid derivative science, Me Too science. Don't be afraid to show your ignorance. If it's an area that you find interesting and you want to pursue, Just own up. I don't know much about this. Who are the people that do? I think speed now is something that we can't ignore. Fail quick and move on is my advice. Being first in a field has advantage, but it's not a justification. Being the first person to jump out of an aircraft without a parachute isn't a recommendation, you know? It's not something that's good. Try and get in on new funding opportunities early. You learn what the rules are, and you can sometimes strike it lucky before the big boys get in and start gaming the system. Present, publish and promote. And by promote, I don't mean yourself, I mean your work. Social media now is a way of getting recognition for your work long before traditional methods, which are citation metrics. If you've got a publication last week that's highly valuable to the field, and if you wait 3 years to see how many citations it gets, you're never ever going to be able to promote that piece of work. But going through alternative metrics that sees how many times it's been tweeted, reported, downloaded, gives you an indication of how valuable that work is. And most importantly, stand on the shoulders of giants. And just finally, research is not a hobby. It's got to be a passion. And you've got to make time to prioritise. Find your mentors, persevere, build relationships. It doesn't matter how good your ideas are. If you haven't got people around you, you'll never make those ideas come to fruition. Collaborate, and don't be frightened to approach people to say, I've got this idea. Are you interested? Develop something that others value. That's probably my biggest piece of advice, and value other people's contributions. Be generous with your time, your data and your opinions, and don't tolerate that, oh, they're just doing research. It's rewarding, and I see Adelaide in the audience here. She texted me while she was in America saying, you know, there's our paper, first time I've ever had any of my work referenced at the American Thoracic Society. And it's a bit of a buzz, you know, to see the fact that other people value what you're doing. And I made the point that in a few minutes there, she influenced hundreds of people. There's 20,000 people at the American Thoracic Society. And that's more than she could ever do in a clinic, doing demand service type work, week in, work out. If you do some of these things, you will end up surrounded by a diverse group of talented individuals. And these are the people I work with at the Institute. But really, once you've got that environment, the rest is up to you. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Steve. We'll keep you here for a minute. Does anyone have any questions? Because we have a mic that we can give you. Maybe I can kick off. Okay, got one. Well, while the microphone's going up, are you using chatbots to write anything for you? Grant applications, things like that?
Yes. The way I use it, particularly in an area where I might be a little bit unfamiliar and I want to find out who I should be talking to, I'll use a chat bot and I'll ask a specific question and see what the response is. Often it's what I'd already put in an outline, but often it gives me additional items to consider, and then I can approach someone and say, well, look, you know, what about this particular issue?
I was very happy to hear you say that in your training in Cambridge, you were being trained in medicine as a science. And that was my background. I come from Belgium and continental Europe. Maybe it's a generational thing or a geographical thing, but we were being taught medicine as a science, and we had scientific methods that were part of the curriculum. when you mentioned all of the challenges, don't you think that we should start in the medical school by providing medical students a little bit more of a rigorous scientific background in genetics and biochemistry and maybe statistics and some physics and all of the things which now seem to be lacking in a medical curriculum?
Look, I do agree with that. I mean, I think, unfortunately, you know, the community now sees medicine in competition with naturopaths, chiropractors, and so we are being forced to squeeze more social medicine into the curriculum. And I don't object to that, but I think that it still needs people with a basic science training. When you look at the explosion of the biological sciences over the last few years, it can be overwhelming unless you've got a basic understanding. Look, I agree that a basic science training was the thing that first of all gave me the inquisitive nature, but also the ability to... I've shifted focus many times over the years, and it's because I've got a basic grounding that I've been able to have that flexibility, I think.
Jerry?
It's just following on from Paul's questions, but
Please use the microphone because it's being recorded.
given the sort of explosion in basic science, as well as explosion in clinical science, how do you fit that into curriculum that's meaningful? Because people are just compressing to get people through in 5 years, 4 years.
As well as the basic science explosion, the tools to explore it have also exploded. And I think what you need to do is give individuals the capability to take advantage of the knowledge that's being generated. COVID was an absolute, example of that, how quickly we could apply basic science to developing biomarkers, diagnostic tests, and ultimately vaccines and antivirals. Nobody started knowing all of that. It was the application of the tools that were there. And in fact, Anthony Fauci said about why is it that we were able to develop vaccines so quickly is because the building blocks were already there. They were already developed. So the same with an individual, if you give them the tools and the building blocks, you don't have to give them the content. And I think that's the important message.
Is there a question? Sorry, up there.
Thank you for such a fantastic talk. It was reassuring to hear when you put up the slide about the Nobel Prize winners and you said, well, look, you can have time for your family life and so on and so forth. I was just wondering if you could expand on that a bit more, because outside of your talk, if someone says to me, oh, well, here's the life of a clinician-scientist, of course, make sure you get published, of course, make sure you get the grants, of course, make sure you do all the stuff that you're required to in clinic, and make sure you do all these things to progress your career, and make sure you, one way of hearing that is, sure, do all these things, but make sure you don't have too much of a life, or make sure you're young and not married yet, and make sure you don't have kids yet,
Yeah, look, I've been very fortunate. Firstly, a very supportive family, but my wife is a talented lawyer, also works long hours. But between us, we've been able to navigate that because we've never put the family ahead of our work. Often things are going well with the family, it gives you an opportunity to exploit your professional interests. But I would never put family behind work. And in fact, an anecdote was I had twins, and I did my first overseas conference in San Francisco when the kids were 6 months old. My wife hadn't gone back to work yet. But the day I left, all three of them got sick. And I the moment I got into my hotel room, I got a phone call from my wife saying, you know, kids are sick, they haven't slept for 24 hours, I'm really sick. And I said, well, I've just arrived, what do you want me to do? And I was presenting the next morning. She held the phone up and I could hear the kids screaming. And she said, do what you think is fucking well best. and I got on a flight the next morning.
One more question.
Thank you, great talk. And I really liked your tip on standing on the giants. And I would like to know your view on how to approach a giant if you sometimes consider yourself as a Lilliput.
Look, I think, generally speaking, giants have got to where they are because they're good at what they do. Now, I think 50 years ago, it was a different environment. I think these days, successful people actually enjoy being approached and asked for their comments on things. So I would just pick up the phone, send a text or send an email, you know, because if that person responds, you know they're going to be helpful. If they don't respond, then you've crossed one off the list.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve. I'd like you to join me in thanking Steve for a great presentation.